Today's gospel is a gospel of suffering and gratitude. Suffering and gratitude. Jesus, as he's walking into a village, is met by 10 lepers. Leprosy was somewhat commonplace at that time in Jesus' world, and it's actually, many people aren't aware of this, it still exists today. It was renamed Hansen's disease to remove the stigma from the term leprosy. And medicine was really only found for it in 1947. But it still exists, and it's a terrible, terrible disease that disfigures the person. It's full of pain. They actually have pieces of their flesh falling off of their bodies. In the Old Testament, the law of the Old Testament actually has injunctions regarding those who have leprosy. In the law of the Old Testament, it says that those with leprosy must stay outside the camp of Israel. And when anyone approaches them, they must yell out, "Unclean, unclean," to warn people who aren't sick away from them. Apparently, when Jesus was entering this village, there were a group of 10 lepers who were traveling together. One of them, interestingly, was a Samaritan who was hated by the Jews, which we presume the other 9 were Jews. But yet leprosy was such a stigma that it erased all other distinctions. So even Jews and Samaritans who hated each other, they could bond with each other in the suffering and their affliction of leprosy. And the hatred, the distinction between Jew and Samaritan was washed away. And their similarity in having this terrible affliction, this terrible suffering. But interestingly, in the story, when Jesus tells them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests," which was also in the law of the Old Testament, that the priests were acted as a kind of health inspector to make sure and to verify that the person was free from the disease. So Jesus tells these 10 lepers, who instead of shouting out, "Unclean, unclean," instead they shout out, "Help, help." They beg Jesus for help. They recognize something in him. And he tells them simply, "Go show yourselves to the priests." And they're obedient. They go. Even though initially they don't see any cure happen, they go, which wasn't a quick trip. It was a long way to Jerusalem. So as they're going, they notice that they're healed. In the act of obedience, of following Jesus, even though what he told them really didn't make a lot of sense because they weren't healed yet, why should they go show themselves to the priests all the way in Jerusalem? But as they are obedient to Jesus, they're healed. And one of them, the Samaritan, turns back. As soon as he sees that he's healed, he turns back, overflowing with gratitude. And he has to express this gratitude. St. Paisios, the modern saint, tells us, "Ungratefulness is a great sin, which Christ censured. Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? This is what Christ asked of the leper, who returned to thank him for healing him. Christ expected gratitude from the 10 lepers, not for himself, but for themselves." So Christ, God, does not need our gratitude necessarily. The gratitude, the doxology that we offer up, the praise and gratitude that we offer up to God is for us. It's for us. That's why he encourages us to have it. So I'd just like to make 3 points about gratitude, and then look at a couple ways that we can express our gratitude. 1, life is difficult. Life is difficult. M. Scott Peck, the author of the classic book, The Road Less Traveled, he says this quite plainly. Life is difficult. This is the great truth, one of the greatest truths. When we come to terms with the fact that we have no right to be comfortable, happy, or prosperous, we can be truly grateful. By accepting that life is difficult and suffering is normal, we can begin to perceive any small comfort as pure gift. So first we have to come to this realization. St. Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:8, he says, "But if we have food and clothing, with these let us be content." If we have food and clothing, with these let us be content. And Paul tells us that he has learned to be content with whatever his station is in life. Unfortunately, as our lives have grown more complicated, we have more technology, it's become easier and easier to have our expectations of convenience in this life rise, and the opportunity to be disappointed rise as well. Second thing I'd like to point out, gratitude is a practice. Gratitude is a practice. It's not an attitude. Now, we're at the beginning of the year where many of us have made New Year's resolutions, perhaps to lose weight, to get into better physical health, to spend more time with our loved ones. When we think about getting into shape, losing weight, we don't say that I need an exercise attitude. We don't say that I need a dieting attitude. We say that we need to do those things. We need to exercise, and we need to diet if we want to see results. It's not just about having thoughts about them. First, we do them, we practice them, and then it becomes an attitude. The same thing is true with gratitude. To say simply, I need to have a more grateful attitude is about as helpful as saying, I need to have a dieting attitude, right? We need to practice gratitude. Gratitude is a practice. Brené Brown, many of you have heard of her. She's quite popular on YouTube. She's an expert on emotions, Brené Brown. And she says, without exception, every person I interviewed who described living a joyful life or who described themselves as joyful actively practiced gratitude and attributed their joyfulness to their gratitude practice. In a word, she said, the key to gratitude is practice, practice, practice. St. Paul says in Philippians 4:11, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. This is something that he had to learn. He had to come to this. St. John Chrysostom, on his commentary on this line, says that contentment is an object of discipline and exercise and care, for it is not easy to attain, but very difficult. So this is something to be content, to learn to be grateful, like the leper in today's story. This is something that we have to practice. Like musicians, constantly practice scales over and over again until the point where it's boring. The same thing happens to us. If we cultivate a sense of gratitude, it becomes second nature. By practicing, we're able then to deploy this gratitude when it's needed, spontaneously. But we have to first practice, like musicians. Gratitude, brothers and sisters, is a practice. It's something we do. We have to, in the 12-step programs, there's a saying, you have to act your way into a new way of thinking, not think your way into a new way of acting, right? Thinking our way into dieting and exercise doesn't usually help. Acting our way into it by doing the things eventually changes our thinking. Point 3, what are the rewards of gratitude? Why should we do these things? Why does St. Paisios say that Jesus wants us to be grateful for our own sake, for our own good? Let me read you some of what the research shows about the objective, scientifically research-proven advantages of being grateful. Gratitude opens the door to more relationships. It improves physical health. It improves psychological health. It enhances empathy and reduces aggression and seeking revenge. It improves self-esteem. It increases mental strength. It improves sleep quality. And a new research shows that it actually increases heart rate variability. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is kind of becoming kind of the rage with the Apple Watches and so on, tracking your heart rate variability. The heart rate variability is associated with improvements in depression and anxiety, improved memory, cognitive functioning. So these are all the benefits we have of gratitude. So you'll ask me, what do we do? How do we do it? I thought I would leave you with 3 examples of ways that we can begin to foster this sense of gratitude, that we can practice gratitude. One, perhaps the easiest, and one that you've maybe already got down from what I see, is come to church. What do we do in church? We celebrate the Eucharist. That's what we're going to do now. After we've read the scriptures and had a homily, we go and we proceed to celebrate the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. We give thanks to God. We gather together in church today to give thanks to God for all his blessings to us. So coming to church to celebrate the Thanksgiving, this is a way that we can practice our gratitude. The second way we can practice our gratitude, serve others. Serve others. Kierkegaard, the philosopher, he said, the door to happiness opens outward. The door to happiness opens outward. So in other words, when we're looking for happiness and contentment within, we need to open the door outward and look to serve others. Another quote, the love of neighbor is the only door out of the dungeon of self. The love of neighbor is the only door out of the dungeon of selves. And that is the paradox. As Father Thomas Hopko used to say, if it's not paradox, it's not orthodox. The paradox is we become fully ourselves by giving ourselves away. So this is another way that we can practice gratitude, that we can cultivate gratitude. And this includes praying for others who are suffering, even when we're suffering ourselves, or especially when we're suffering ourselves, to pray for others. That is service to others as well. Third, and finally, we have to take care of ourselves and cultivate a sense of wonder, focusing on the daily. In the lepers, we have a story of suffering and miracle, wonder and gratitude. What if we had that sense of wonder in our daily lives? What if we began to see all the daily miracles that happen? What if, being content with our food and clothing, we saw everything that God gives us as a gift? Because life is difficult. Life is suffering. And all the little good things that we get, we don't expect life to be easy. We don't feel entitled to an easy life, but that we recognize life is difficult, involves suffering. Think of the suffering of the lepers over so many years. But I would submit to you that God was with the lepers equally in the suffering as he was in the miracle. The miracle was simply an intensification of his presence with them, but that he was with them in the suffering. Father George Calciu was a Romanian priest who spent over 20 years in communist prison in Romania for his Orthodox faith, suffering unbelievably in these harsh prison conditions. And he said, Christ suffered in order to suffer with us, to fill our suffering with his presence. Christ came to fill our suffering with his presence, to suffer with us. So even in our suffering, we can recognize the presence of God. I saw another quote this week that said, God comes disguised as our life. God comes disguised as our life. Every moment in our life is an opportunity to recognize where God is working, to see those little miracles that we take for granted. Another quote that I saw this week that struck me is, your problem is not a want of wonders. Your problem is a want of wonder. Your problem is not a want of wonders, miracles, things to be amazed about in life, to be grateful for, but a want of wonder. We've lost that sense of wonder at the miraculous that happens around us all the time. A few weeks ago, Father Micah spoke very beautifully about his infant son and how he feels the wind blowing on him. And it's a wonder. It's a wonder to him. He's grateful to God. He smiles because God has provided this little breeze in his life. We, as we grow older and our expectations rise, forget the sense of wonder. So I would say the third thing we can do to cultivate wonder in our lives, to practice gratitude, is to really focus on the daily. Focus on the daily. Mother Teresa, the Catholic nun, said, "Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love." Let's focus on doing that. Let's focus on the small things in our lives that we can be grateful to God for. And let's focus on serving others. Serving others even in small ways that may seem insignificant, but we fill it with love. And we transform perhaps their suffering into gratitude, but we certainly transform our own suffering into gratitude. So, brothers and sisters, life is difficult. There is suffering. Gratitude is a practice. It's not just a way of thinking. Gratitude is first and foremost a practice. And there are many rewards to doing this. So how do we get started? Come to church. Continue coming to church. Have that Eucharistic mindset of always offering up our sacrifice to God in thanksgiving. 2, serve others. The door to happiness opens outward. We fill ourselves when we fill others. And 3rd, cultivate that sense of wonder, the miraculous in our life. And let these be the beginning of a new sense of gratitude in this new year. Amen.